Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I am the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have a guest that I've tried for a while to get on the program, and we finally made things work, and that is Dr. J. Gordon Melton. Gordon, welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad we were able to finally have a time when we were both in the same place, same time.
Well, let me read a little bit of your bio from the Baylor website. It's a pretty long one. I'll try and read some relevant excerpts, and if you want to add something to it, we'll do that. Gordon became Distinguished Professor of American Religious History at Baylor University's Institute for Studies in Religion in March of 2011. And you recently retired, is that correct, Gordon?
About a year ago.
About a year ago. He also serves as the director of the Institute for the Study of American Religion in Woodway, Texas. Since joining ISR, he has been developing a set of joint projects between ISR and the Woodway-based Institute, the initial project being a comprehensive census of the American Buddhist and Hindu communities completed in 2010, with an updated census having been launched in 2019. He has produced a huge body of scholarship, including he's responsible for the publication of more than 400 reference and scholarly texts since its founding, including multiple editions of Melton's Encyclopedia of American Religions, with the 9th edition being published in 2016. Other publications include the award-winning Religions of the World, a comprehensive encyclopedia of belief and practice, and Religious Celebrations, an encyclopedia of holidays, festivals, solemn observances, and spiritual commemorations, and most recently completed the 4-volume Faiths Across Time, 5,000 Years of Religious History in 2014. Gordon also is a pioneer in the field of new religious movements and helped to create the subdiscipline. He sits on the international board of the Center for Studies in New Religions based in Turin, Italy, the primary academic association focusing on studies of new and minority religions. Gordon, anything else you want to add to that?
No, it gets at it pretty well. We have just finished up some follow-up to that Buddhist and Hindu census data that we collected. We've done a survey of all of the religious groups in America that come from East Asia. That's Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and have submitted that data to Fingan Yang at Purdue University, and he's going to turn it into one of his maps. He's been doing maps of the East Asian countries on their religious centers. So we decided that we'd deal with the immigration of East Asians. It was very interesting results that there were more Korean congregations in America than there are Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese congregations put together. And so the presence that we all feel in our churches of the Koreans element is very real. Been a large number of Korean Christians who moved to the United States and founded churches.
And I suppose I would be remiss if we didn't mention your work, your interest in the church in China.
I very much have, and since the changes in Chinese religious law that came into effect right before the pandemic, and it's continued to grow and expand, our work there has been curtailed, and at this point, unless there's some real shifts backward, I don't think I'll be returning to China. It's just not a receptive place for research anymore.
That's unfortunate. Well, today we're going to be talking about your research in the Church of Scientology and shedding light rather than heat on that topic. How long have you been studying the Church of Scientology?
Actually, since the 1960s. I moved to Chicago from my home in Birmingham in '64, and within a year or two, I had made contact with what was then called the Nomad Mission, If you can imagine, the center of the Church of Scientology in Chicago was an apartment in a high-rise apartment building. A young couple had established this as the first Scientology center, and I followed it along, through that time. At one point, I was serving a parish in Evanston, Illinois, and the Church of Scientology just so happened at that time they were growing, and the only place they could find was a office building just a couple of blocks from my church in Evanston. They were there for a few years while we were putting out an edition of the Encyclopedia. So I got to know them real well at that point, and then they moved on into Chicago. So I've been keeping up with them since the late 60s.
That is a long period of research with, I'm sure, a lot of changes along the way. Can you summarize its origins and its founder, L. Ron Hubbard?
L. Ron Hubbard was a writer. He had developed after he dropped out of school. He had an amazing ability with the old typewriters before the days of electric typewriters, and especially before the days of computers. He could write over. He did 100 words a minute. He was like the best executive secretary ever imagine, and he could turn out stories at a high clip. At the time when he was specializing in science fiction stories primarily, he would turn out 3 or 4 stories and present them to the editors of the science fiction magazines. They buy all the stories, and there are editions of the old science fiction pups that all the stories are written by Hubbard under pseudonyms.
Wow.
And so he was quite talented, but he got into thinking about the human condition, particularly what we would think of as mental health problems, and came up with some techniques for, he thought, dealing with those problems. In the process, he got into what we would call Western esotericism, think theosophy or Rosicrucianism. So his thought world was very similar to theosophy, and he began to write on those topics a wee bit before the war. During the war, he entered the Navy, was a lieutenant on a boat that was assigned off the coast. That career is interesting because it's all messed up in terms of the United States didn't want people to know that Japanese submarines were floating off of the western coast of the U.S. during World War II, and that there were actually ships that were having encounters with them. Hubbard's ship was one of those small vessels that was keeping up with the Japanese subs, but that story is still partly classified documents. The whole story of the Western, the war off California, so to speak, has not come out yet. After the war, then he returned in part to science fiction writing, but then began to write seriously about the human condition. He had several articles published, and then his monumental book in 1950 of Dianetics, which kind of first put the system together. And right on the heels of Dianetics, his explorations took him into past lives and reincarnation, and that did the shift. Dianetics he thought of as what we term psychology. He didn't like psychology, so he wouldn't use the term, but it was a psychological exploration of the mental side of the human. But once he got into reincarnation and past lives. He said, this is a spiritual dimension. And so suddenly he was thrown up against religion. And that led in 1952 to the founding of the first organizations of Scientology. And then in 54, some people who were formerly Dianetic students who followed him into his Scientology beliefs founded the first Church of Scientology in Los Angeles. Soon after that, the church in Washington was founded, called the Founding Church, even though it wasn't the first. And then the church in San Diego, the first local center of Scientologists. So it's and from there, what we know as the Church of Scientology was put together.
How large is it, and what kind of growth has it experienced over the years?
Well, the growth has been significant. How large it is one thing we don't know. The church itself claims that it's in multi-millions. It's certainly in the maybe a million, million and a half members that we can count and see. But that's an issue that is quite sensitive about the church as to how many they have. But they have not congregations, they have churches, buildings where Scientology services are offered across the United States. And they probably have 100 to 150,000 members here, what we would think of as members. There are, beyond that, there's a lot of hangers-on and people who've had some brush with Scientology that has been significant for them. But we really don't know. It's just organized very differently as a Western esoteric group rather than as what we would think of as a church with congregations.
Now, in light of Western esotericism, can you help us understand some of the beliefs, its sacred texts, if that's a fair way to characterize them, practices? What's the essence of are those things about?
Western esotericism is the belief that has continued from what we know of as ancient Gnosticism. It's the Gnostic religion brought into the modern world. Gnosticism has a continuous history in the West since the first century, at least, and it got a real boost after the Reformation. It was an object of persecution under the medieval Catholic Church, and the main place it survived was in the mystic communities that had developed. But in about 100 years after the Reformation, the Rosicrucian Society, first Rosicrucian Society, was founded in Germany, and that marked the rebirth of Western esotericism. It then is transmitted from Rosicrucianism to Theosophy. Freemasonry is a part of it. And then in the modern world, Wicca and ritual magic have developed. It's an interesting kind of belief system. It believes that the universe evolved from God, wasn't what we would call created, but that God, who is pure spirit, kind of created extensions of himself by evolving levels of less and less spirituality, and you go through X number of layers and you get to the modern world where spirituality becomes embedded in materialism. So that the goal of thinking in esoteric groups is enlightenment. Knowledge, and Gnosticism is knowledge, and the knowledge frees you from the material world and allows you to return to the spiritual world. So the basic thing you will encounter in Gnosticism will be techniques to free you from the material, get you back to the spiritual. That in Gnosticism, in Gnostic like groups, you have classes rather than worship services. So you go to classes to learn how to get out of the material world. That's what makes it different, because you don't go for regular worship services every week. You go when your class meets at whatever level you are. That's another thing about Gnostic groups. They think in terms of levels, so that you go in, you learn the material at one level, and then you pass to the next level, and then you, along the way, you go through all the levels and you get to ultimate truth. And so it's not a revelatory religion. It's a religion of education and process.
So when L. Ron Hubbard was studying the human predicament and started writing in this area, what were his conclusions? What did he think the human problem was, and how did what he discovered or present, how did that answer that human predicament?
Well, he thought the human problem was that we had accumulated bad karma from all our past lives. He called them engrams, these little bits of bad experiences and behaviors that caused our lives to be dysfunctional. And Dianetics was a process of cleaning those engrams from us. And he thought originally that when you got all your engrams cleared, you were clear. And that was what Dianetics was all about. But then he discovered past lives. And he said, oh, the problem is that we still have engrams from our past lives. And so the higher levels of Scientology had to do with clearing what we would think of as the soul of all of the garbage that it brought from past lives. He called the soul the Thetan, and the Thetan is the continuous part of us. And so in the upper levels of Scientology, you learn how to separate the Thetan from the body, out-of-body travel. And then the lessons you learn along the way are to clean the Thetan of its engrams. You've already cleaned the human psyche of its engrams, the present, you at present, from the things from this present life. That's what Dianetics does. But now you're going to go and clean the Thetan of its past lives. So the higher levels allow you to do that. And there are supposedly 15 higher levels, only 8 of which have been revealed. In Scientology, the process of cleaning the engrams involves a process called auditing, in which you sit with another person and you go through exercises with them that allow you to do the cleaning. But as you get to the higher levels, the number of auditors that are available to assist you in those higher cleanings is small. The number of people who are at the higher levels is relatively small. And they would tell you that the 9th level will be available as soon as we get enough people at the 8th level to go up to the 9th level. And so they supposedly are holding those still higher levels for the future, and will release them when the time comes.
Well, I looked at some of your research in this to prepare for our conversation, and one of the things you discuss is the Sea Org. And what I found interesting about the way you treated it is you notice how it functions similarly to religious orders and other religious traditions. Can you describe what the Sea Org is and how that works within Scientology?
Yes, as Hubbard developed the lower levels of science post-clear Scientology work. And he trained a group of people to do them while they were at sea on a ship. And so he called the organization of those who were going to release these levels to the movement as a whole, the Sea Organization. And he, you know, those people with whom he invested this sacred knowledge, he turned into an ordered community. And then as the church went through its development, the decision was made to make the entire church above the Dianetics level as space for the Sea Org, and that the Sea Org should be running that church. So today, everyone in the church who is in a responsible position above the local church, that is at the national, the regional, and the global context, they are members of the Sea Org. And the Sea Org is, I use the analogy of the Jesuits. It's very much like the Jesuits. When you join the Sea Org, you agree to the basic positions of a Roman Catholic order: poverty, obedience, and chastity. Now, the difference with the Sea Org is that the chastity is not a part of the thing. So, as a Sea Org member, you can marry, and you can, if you have time and energy, have sexual relations with your wife. What you cannot do in the Sea Org is you cannot have children. So if you are married and you and your wife are continuing your relationships, then you have to use some kind of prophylactic. I have known people who have had children and had to make that decision. The fellow who ran the Santa Barbara church during the years I was there, he and his wife had 2 children, and they were both members of the Sea Org, and so they left the Sea Org and took over the church in Santa Barbara and ran it for 15 years while their children grew to college age. After their children were out of the home, they rejoined the Sea Org, and they now live in Washington, D.C. and help run the founding church in Washington, which is a tourist center for the church. And but the Sea Org functions. There are somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 members of the Sea Org, but they run the higher levels of the church. So they run all the international offices, and they run the higher grades. Where you go to a church where you get go through the higher levels. They run that. They run there's a large ship, tourist ship, that is function. It's stationed in one of the Caribbean islands, and for the highest levels, you have to go there for level 7 and 8, and so that's kind of the way it's organized.
The church has also been something of a lightning rod for controversy over the years. I've got a couple of questions that fit within that context. One is there have been critics who have denied it's a religion, but you've written on how it meets the qualifications of a religion. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, that's been a major problem for the church, because in Western Europe, most of the Western Europe countries, Spain and France, Germany, um, do not define Western esoteric groups as religion. The Rosicrucian groups, Theosophy, operate there as secular organizations, where in North America we see them as religions. What the Church of Scientology did is it defined itself as a religion, and when it went to Western Europe, uh, it could have operated quite nicely as an association, even a spiritual association. But it said, no, we are a church. We marry, we bury. We do all the things that a church does, and we want to be recognized as a church. And so some countries did, but Germany, France, and Spain especially did not. And that's where the fight developed, so to speak, 50 years ago. I have to go through a process just with each edition of my encyclopedia. When I add groups to the encyclopedia, does it fit? And so every issue of the encyclopedia, we have groups we consider and don't put in because they don't meet the threshold. But Scientology certainly does. It fits into the whole esoteric tradition. It marries, it buries, it has clergy, it has worship services, even though its main function is to conduct the classes toward spiritual liberation. But just as I would consider not ancient Gnosticism as a religion, and there's very little controversy along those lines, it has all the characteristics that made the ancient Gnostics a religion. So there's no reason not to consider it that way.
Yeah, I realized I recalled as I asked the question not too long ago, I had George Chryssidis on, who co-edited the book on contested concepts in the study of religion. So the whole idea of religion isn't a slam dunk as a notion to begin with. So it's kind of interesting how some have seized onto that to try and deny them the religious kind of thing. So there are the scholarly definitions and the legal definitions, and they meet both of those. Is that correct?
They do, and they had a long time. They had a 25-year fight in the U.S. to get their tax exemption and be recognized by the IRS as a religion. But pretty much most countries now accept them as a religion. It's been a hard go in some places, but France, they still have a few problems. Spain is probably the place where they have the most problems, but that's another interesting story of there. But it's hard to deny them that they are a religion.
My last question has to do with another area of controversy. As you know, over the years, there have been a number of former members who have raised concerns in the media. There are constant exposés, for lack of a better term. The secular anti-cult movement is constantly writing critically. Sometimes even the Christian counter-cult movement does that, like Watchman Fellowship did in the past. Can you talk about the context in which this criticism arises? In the past, we had the cult wars, and that kind of died down. But now it's fascinating to me. You've got these documentaries about so-called cult groups. You've got the media using the term and the concept, and brainwashing is there again. You've got some psychologists who are calling certain political commitments cultic, like voting for Trump and this type of a thing. How does Scientology fit within both the past and what we're seeing in the present with this controversy?
Well, when the anti-cult movement, as we know it today, began back in the 70s, Scientology was one of about 24 groups that were spotted as being cults by the movement. And then the issue of deprogramming developed. So the cult wars was really a fight about can you deprogram people? Can you kidnap people and hold them against their will while you run them through an anti-programming model of understanding attachment to new religions? That was pretty much decided, and there are very few places in the world. Japan was probably the last that allowed deprogrammings to occur. And Korea, there's still a little bit of deprogramming that's going on in Korea, but not much. And so we think of the end of the cult wars as being when we put deprogramming aside. But the whole effort at fighting cults never went away. There was the Christian counter-cult movement that fought groups because they were not Christian. And then there has been the secular anti-cult movement. Interestingly enough, after they lost deprogramming, the first target that they had were the polygamists. And so they joined the anti-polygamy wars, which are still happening, interestingly enough. And then most recently have picked up on the women's movement, the children's movement to prevent various kinds of sexual and violent abuse of children and women. And this is also allowed them to focus on both aspects of those kinds of cases, namely the criminal aspect and the civil aspect. So we have two cases right now, one with La Luz de Mundo, large Mexican group whose leader is in jail for child abuse, and the Scientology case with Masterson, celebrity personalities, who's been convicted now of 3 cases of rape. But both La Luz de Mundo and Scientology now face civil cases, so that the women who were found to be victims of rape in criminal court have now filed civil cases. And so there will be several trials that will come up in which La Luz de Mundo and then Scientology will be sued. And this is kind of the deep pockets aspect of the case. Masterson doesn't have that much money, but Church Scientology does. The former head of the La Luz de Mundo doesn't have that much money, but La Luz de Mundo does. La Luz de Mundo is in Mexico what the Southern Baptists are here. It's the second largest non-Roman Catholic group in the country. So that's what's happening with both cases. Is they're now turning to prepare for these civil cases that will be coming up, and there will be a half dozen of them probably.
So what is it that makes? I appreciate the historical context and the comparison between past and present. What is it that has made Scientology so that there are a certain number of groups? It's fascinating. Out of all the new religions and religious movements out there, there are a handful that have been the focus of these kinds of critiques. Any ideas as to what has made them stand out for so many people?
Well, one thing is their success. They are arguably the largest of the Western esoteric groups. Only the Amorc Rosicrucians compete with them in terms of size and how many countries that they have an active membership in. One of the things we forget to look at is why are they successful? Well, they're successful because they are presenting the old perennial philosophy. I mean, it's a very attractive religion, and has always been such in the West. But their development of the Sea Org has been a key notion, if we can get back to there, is that esotericism appeals to the individual. It's a very individualized group, and it develops the individual. It doesn't develop groups. There's nothing like a congregation. So all of a sudden you have the Sea Org that's like the Jesuits. It's a lifetime commitment. It's 6.5 days a week of activity. It has a fairly rigid organization and control. And overwhelmingly, the people who have come out and oppose Scientology are former members of the Sea Org. So it's the complaint of the control that they experienced in the Sea Org and the process of getting out that they found disturbing. There have been some other things, other issues along the way, but that's been the major focus. And Scientology has a lot of rules and regulations, especially once you get into the higher levels of the organization. Down low in the beginning stages, it's very free and very much like other esoteric groups. But once you get up higher into it, it's very controlling, and that's been what's has fueled the hostility about it. Also, it's like Mennonite groups. Some Mennonite groups, they have a process of shunning. So if a member leaves, they lose a lot of social relationships as well. And if Scientology is very active in shall we say, countering those people who oppose it. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, a popular group to go after, they have a policy. They just don't answer their critics. They don't deal with them. And but Scientology is just the opposite. It if you say something they think is wrong, not if you express you don't like Scientology, that's fine. But if you say Scientologists do this and that, and they say, no, we don't, then they will counter you on that. And so that has brought a kind of hostility to them, because they had a habit of taking people to court if they wrote books about them and didn't get their facts right.
Well, that's a very helpful introduction to the Church of Scientology, and I appreciate your expertise, your years of research, and your professional association with me and friendship over the years. Even though when we first started in connection with the evangelical countercult, we got into a little trouble. But I appreciate you coming on the program.
Well, as you might be aware, we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, yes.
And I hope you'll track down some of the other people that have studied and written about Scientology, and bring them on board. It's important, and it's an important issue for those of us who are Christian and who want to live a Christian lifestyle, present a Christian view to people. Scientology is a large and growing movement, and I've seen nothing that's going to block that growth in the future.
Very good. Well, again, Gordon, thank you for coming on the program. This is Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead. Until the next episode, thanks to everybody for watching and listening.